The Western Front in Europe in the autumn of 1944 presented a complex and delicate situation. Following the Allied breakthrough in Normandy, the Allies rapidly advanced towards northern France and Belgium, while the Germans, having lost significant armored forces, gradually retreated to their envisioned Western Wall. Although the overall situation favored the Allies, strained supply lines, uneven advances among army groups, and the presence of remaining German armored units in the Ardennes forced Allied command to seek a method that could both tie down German mobile forces and avoid the cost of a direct assault. Against this backdrop, the U.S. Army's 23rd Special Forces was deployed to the border region between France and Luxembourg to carry out a highly classified and unique mission, to create a fictitious armored division using sound, visual, and radio signals, convincing the Germans that the main Allied forces were concentrating in the area, thus forcing the Germans to deploy troops in response. This unit later became known in war history as the Ghost Army, while their official designation at the time was 23rd Headquarters Special Forces. Its composition was extremely unique compared to ordinary combat units. The unit comprised not only engineers, camouflage specialists, and radio technicians, but also a large number of artists and designers from art schools, theaters, and advertising agencies. They were responsible for designing and constructing realistic fake tanks, trucks, positions, and camps, highly deceptive from a distance or from the air. The unit also included soldiers with professional recording and sound backgrounds, who had worked for broadcasting companies or film studios before the war and were familiar with the production of large sound fields and the laws of sound propagation. These technicians were assigned to the 3132nd Sound Specialized Company, and their performance in this operation constituted an extremely rare record of fighting with sound in military history. In the weeks leading up to the operation, some key members of the Ghost Army had completed their planning. Lieutenant Ralph Inman, a sound engineer, had previously worked at RCA, overseeing experimental projects for military loudspeaker systems. Before setting off, he showed his team the recordings they would be using. These recordings came from real armored units, including the engine sounds of M4 Sherman tanks at different speeds, the sound of tracks moving across gravel and mud, the sounds of supply convoys consisting of half-tracks and trucks moving, and the metallic clanging of engineers building bridges at night. These recordings were not simply played unedited, they were precisely combined into a sequence of scenarios. For example, from the convoy's assembly at dusk, to its nighttime expansion into positions, and then to the armored units probing and directional shifts at dawn. Lieutenant Inman repeatedly emphasized in internal briefings that their objective was not to create a huge noise, but to convince enemy eavesdroppers that the sounds came from a real combat unit. The success of this operation was closely related to the institutionalization of psychological warfare that the U.S. Army had begun before the war. After reviewing British deception experiences in North Africa, the U.S. Army gradually realized that deceiving the German Army relied not only on visual camouflage but also on creating a consistent chain of false information within the enemy's reconnaissance system. The German Army possessed a high level of expertise in radio surveillance, aerial reconnaissance, and ground reconnaissance. If any aspect of the Allied deception operation faltered, even the most convincing visual camouflage would fail to fool German intelligence's cross-referencing. Therefore, the Ghost Army's operations had to be perfectly synchronized across all three dimensions. Radio signals had to match the characteristics of a real U.S. armored division, sound had to be consistent with the movement logic of a large number of armored vehicles, and visual camouflage had to withstand long-range reconnaissance. Before the operation was approved, U.S. command had already learned that German listening posts in northern Luxembourg were closely monitoring Allied radio traffic and recording signs of heavy equipment movement. In particular, in early September, the Germans repeatedly reported intelligence in the region suggesting a northward movement of an armored division, but this intelligence was not confirmed. Therefore, U.S. intelligence saw this as the perfect opportunity to conduct a deception operation. By creating enough evidence in the area, German intelligence was likely to connect these scattered clues, thus concluding that the Allies were preparing an offensive in the region. To protect the deception operation from being detected by German reconnaissance teams, the U.S. military transferred a small reconnaissance platoon from the 82nd Airborne Division. Led by Sergeant Charles Hawkins, these paratroopers were responsible for perimeter patrols during the operation, ensuring no German infiltrators could approach the fake camps and camouflaged vehicles. They were unaware of the full details of the operation, as Ghost Army's operations were highly classified, but they understood they had to prevent any contact that could disrupt the deception. The operation took place in the rural area east of Thionville, characterized by gentle hills, forests, and scattered villages. The U.S. military chose this location for their deception positions because the terrain facilitated sound propagation and reflection, concealing the deployment of fake equipment and loudspeakers. More importantly, the area frequently appeared on German reconnaissance routes, based on flight paths. With proper deployment, German aerial reconnaissance personnel were highly likely to capture images of the camouflaged positions during routine patrols. The combination of reconnaissance images, radio traffic, and ground-based surveillance data was precisely the basis for German intelligence's assessment. On the eve of the operation, members of the 603rd Engineer Camouflage Battalion began setting up inflatable tanks and dummy trucks under the moonlight. These rubber models, rapidly inflated by air compressors, were virtually indistinguishable from real Sherman tanks from 100 meters away. From a distance, the outlines, shadows, and sizes of these dummy tanks matched those of real vehicles, while their specially designed paint scheme made them even more deceptive in low-light conditions. The engineers also constructed dummy artillery positions using logs, canvas, and barbed wire, and used lights to control flashlights to simulate nighttime camp activities. Meanwhile, technicians from the 406th Radio Company began simulating the radio communication patterns of a real U.S. armored division. They needed to mimic not only radio call signs but also generate realistic radio traffic, including logistical requests, reconnaissance reports, and unit location notifications. This traffic was arranged in a complex but plausible structure, leading German interceptors to believe it was an armored force completing its assembly and preparing for attack. Even more difficult to detect beneath the surface, the 3132nd Sound Specialized Company was setting up a massive loudspeaker system. The loudspeakers were connected to recording and playback equipment via multiple camouflaged cables, installed in the cargo compartments of vehicles disguised as ordinary trucks. In his final briefing of the operation, Lieutenant Inman instructed his men to pay close attention to the direction and timing of the sounds, as sound deception was not simply about amplifying noise, but required adherence to certain tactical logic. For example, playing too many tank startup sounds in a short period would make the enemy believe the unit lacked organization. Playing a large number of vehicle running sounds late at night would suggest a lack of necessity for the operation. Therefore, all sounds had to be strictly synchronized with a fictitious operation plan designed to mislead the Germans into believing that the Americans would launch a probing attack within 3 days. The paratroopers were deployed on the perimeter at dusk. They were not fully aware of the operation's details, but they sensed an atypical preparation taking place inside the camp. Sergeant Hawkins, in a hushed explanation to his platoon members, said he didn't know why these strange engineers were fiddling with rubber tanks at night, but their mission was to ensure that any unexpected visitors could not approach the border. In his post-war memoirs, he recalled vaguely realizing he was participating in some kind of dummy position, but didn't grasp its scale or technological complexity. As night fell, the first sound test began. From the distant forest came the sound of what sounded like a tank engine slowly warming up, followed by the scraping of tracks over gravel, and then the faint sound of a convoy of trucks moving. These sounds were precisely controlled to be slightly lower than the actual volume to create the believable nighttime movement of distant troops. Lieutenant Inman stood beside the loudspeaker system, listening to the overall mixture through headphones. His assistant recorded the direction, angle, and intensity of the sound propagation, adjusting it based on terrain reflections. The camp appeared silent in the night, but at the German listening post 2 kilometers away, listening soldiers wearing headphones were recording these sounds. They were accustomed to judging the type and number of vehicles moving, and the Ghost Army's sound design was precisely aimed at these judgment mechanisms. As the test progressed, German listeners began recording information about suspected American armored vehicle assembly and prepared to report to their superiors. The first phase of the operation began to take shape in this silent tension, and this was only the beginning of a complex operation. As the first night's sound experiments echoed through the depths of the forest, the entire camouflage position maintained a strict silence on the surface. All lights were processed into point sources to avoid nighttime observation by German reconnaissance aircraft, while simultaneously ensuring that reconnaissance images presented a distribution of light spots consistent with actual camp activity. Engineers deployed several generators around the camp perimeter, but the noise from these generators had to be kept extremely low to avoid interfering with the main sonic deception. Most of the personnel inside the camp wore ordinary combat uniforms rather than engineer uniforms. Some soldiers even deliberately wore armored unit patches, making it difficult for any potential German close-range scouts to easily identify this as an atypical unit composed of artists, engineers, and sound engineers. Parachute patrols were divided into 3 directions on the map, responsible for monitoring forest paths where enemy infiltration might occur. They were informed of German reconnaissance squad activity in the area and therefore had to remain highly vigilant. However, they were unaware that they were not protecting a real armored division, but rather the stage for a large-scale psychological warfare operation. Sergeant Charles Hawkins clearly understood that if even a single German scout approached the camouflaged position and saw the rubber material of the fake tanks or heard the noise of the playback equipment, the entire operation would immediately fail. Therefore, while these paratroopers didn't directly participate in the deception, they constituted a necessary guarantee for its success. As midnight approached, the Sound Special Operations Company began playing the complete nighttime vehicle assembly sequence. The first segment of the recording was the engine sounds of several tanks slowly entering the position, spaced regularly between each other, as if directed by an experienced platoon leader, followed by the metallic clanging of half-tracks unloading supplies. Shortly after, 2 brief command commands were added to the recording, originally from real unit exercise records, kept so that they were barely discernible but not so detailed that listeners could easily identify the specific language. During the playback, the Sound Special Operations Company constantly adjusted the speaker positions based on wind direction, temperature, humidity, and terrain reflection. Sometimes, simply moving the speaker by an angle or reducing the volume by a third could create a noticeably different propagation effect over several kilometers. Simultaneously, the Radio Deception Company also began synchronously generating fictitious communication traffic. A technical officer known as Captain Steiner oversaw this part of the operation. He was familiar with the technical capabilities of German listening posts before the war and understood the German analytical methods. German listeners not only recorded radio content but also determined troop size and organizational structure based on transmission frequencies, communication intervals, and signal characteristics. To make the fictional armored division appear more realistic, Steiner had technicians mimic the communication patterns of a real U.S. armored division, such as using similar call sign rhythms, similar radio bands, and similar order of command transmission. The technicians even deliberately included several communication errors as part of the deception, as real troops often experienced channel confusion, signal duplication, or false alarms during nighttime operations. Combined, the German listening posts began receiving increasingly dense signals around 2 a.m. At a forward listening point in northern Luxembourg, 2 German communications personnel, wearing headsets, had several listening logs from the previous days on their desks. In the logs, they had repeatedly detected the movement of U.S. vehicles, but these sounds were not taken seriously by their superiors due to their lack of continuity. At that moment, they heard a low, mechanical sound approaching, followed by the faint noise of a convoy of trucks moving. They jotted down notes, suspected nighttime assembly of armored units, and when the next recording came through, they realized it wasn't a random sound, but rather the sound of a well-organized army making a nighttime mobilization. The German receivers, though unable to determine the scale, could tell the number of vehicles was not small. They passed the notes to the duty officer, who, after assessment, decided to submit a preliminary report to the intelligence team before dawn. On the ground that same night, a minor incident nearly hampered the operation. Sergeant Hawkins' paratrooper patrol discovered unusual footprints on a path in the northern forest. Judging from the depth and direction of the footprints, they suspected German scouts might be approaching the camouflaged positions. Hawkins signaled for the team to spread out in a fan shape and ordered 2 paratroopers to circle around to the left, attempting to cut off the potential enemy's retreat. The paratroopers moved silently in the darkness, the only sound the distant screeching of tracks from loudspeakers. About 10 minutes later, one of the paratroopers noticed a faint metallic clanging sound coming from the bushes ahead. He immediately signaled for the team to stop. Over the next few minutes, they cautiously approached the bushes and discovered that the footprints belonged to a local farmer. The man, extremely nervous when suddenly surrounded by the American patrol, repeatedly explained that he was only checking on his lost livestock. Sergeant Hawkins, through a translator, confirmed that the farmer was not a German spy, but still emphasized that he was not allowed to approach the area. If the man had indeed strayed into the camouflaged positions and seen the fake tanks or loudspeakers, the news would spoil the entire operation. The paratroopers eventually escorted the farmer back to his village. Although it was a false alarm, Hawkins stated in a post-war interview that he realized at the time that such accidental factors were more dangerous than German reconnaissance teams because they could not take the same lethal measures as they would against enemy forces. Inside the camouflage positions, personnel made continuous fine-tuning throughout the night to maximize the deception. Engineers adjusted the positions of the dummy tanks before dawn, aligning their arrangement more closely with the logic of real armored units assembling at night. Lighting teams used filtered lights to simulate patrol lights within the camp, while a special sound company prepared to play a pre-recorded message about vehicle regrouping at dawn. At daybreak, a thin fog shrouded the area, making it harder for distant observers to discern the true location of the vehicles. German reconnaissance aircraft flew overhead, capturing several blurry images showing what appeared to be a large number of vehicles, their outlines dotted out. Ground-based radio traffic records corroborated these images with nighttime surveillance footage, further enhancing their credibility. By the following morning, U.S. Command received intelligence reporting a significant change in the deployment of German armored forces in the area. Some German armored units began moving south, seemingly intending to halt a potential U.S. offensive. This German reaction was in line with U.S. expectations, as they believed it indicated Allied armored forces were preparing to break through the defenses in northern Luxembourg. This response benefited from the verification mechanism within the German intelligence system. Reconnaissance aerial imagery needed to be analyzed in conjunction with wiretapping records and radio traffic. Because the Ghost Army created enough logically consistent clues across all 3 dimensions, German intelligence mistakenly identified the area as the next Allied offensive direction. Within the operation, the Sound Special Forces Company and Radio Company entered the second phase. They had to keep this fictitious armored division present for at least 2 days to ensure German troop movements. The intensity of the sound recordings was deliberately reduced during the day, playing only minor maintenance sounds, such as brief engine starts and the metallic clanging of engineers working on vehicle chassis. Visual camouflage was even more crucial during the day. Engineers constantly fine-tuned the outlines of the fake tanks to ensure no obvious flaws were visible from an aerial reconnaissance perspective. Parachute patrols remained vigilant, also tasked with preventing any civilians from approaching during the day. This task was more difficult than at night because village activity increased during the day, and German reconnaissance teams were more likely to use camouflage. Sergeant Hawkins' team even intercepted a vehicle suspected to be a German light motorcycle reconnaissance vehicle on a country road, only to discover upon closer inspection that it was merely a lost driver from a U.S. logistics unit. While such misjudgments weren't fatal, they kept the entire operation on edge. Everyone involved knew that the success of this operation depended on an extremely fragile balance. If any link in the chain faltered, for example, a speaker being destroyed by German artillery fire, a dummy tank collapsing due to the wind and being photographed by a reconnaissance plane, or a farmer entering the camouflage position and seeing the real situation, the entire deception would collapse. Therefore, this seemingly distant artist unit experienced pressure no less intense than frontline combat units. However, despite all this pressure, the operation steadily progressed into the crucial second night. After completing its deployment near Dover, the Ghost Army began the second phase of the operation, simulating the imminent assembly of U.S. armored and infantry forces with gradually increasing sound field density. They deployed recording equipment along the road in several consecutive sections, making the sounds heard by German reconnaissance planes patrolling at night appear as if a large force was moving more than 10 kilometers deep. To mislead German intelligence analysts into believing it was a typical Allied troop buildup, Perkins instructed operators to adjust the sound field according to the actual logistical schedules of U.S. troops. For example, real armored divisions typically increase tank movement frequency 36 hours before arriving at the front. Therefore, the Ghost Army was required to increase the volume and loop density of the recordings during the same time periods. Furthermore, armored engine sounds were often alternated with supply truck sounds to match the real-world logic of simultaneous increases and decreases in supply and movement. All these details needed to be simulated on topographic maps beforehand to ensure the created sound source chain matched the actual troop build-up behavior, preventing German listening units from detecting any flaws when receiving the audio. The most difficult task during this operation was avoiding mechanical repetition of sound sources at close range. To enhance realism, Cressman and Sadiq had already layered different segments of the same recording with slight time differences before setting out, creating randomness during repeated playback. They also added subtle background noises to the tapes, such as distant wind, the clanging of metal tools, and faint commands. These subtle details were often not fully recorded by German listening equipment, but would create the impression of a realistic on-site recording in the minds of the listeners. To handle these details, Holden even required the recorders to collect ambient noise from actual armored division locations, ensuring the Ghost Army had unedited, authentic material. Holden emphasized, "We are not imitating the Army, but replicating it. The difference between the two will determine whether the enemy can detect us." This extremely realistic simulation quickly proved effective at the end of May. German listening posts in the Calais area recorded gradually increasing mechanical noise during 3 consecutive night patrols and subsequently reported this intelligence to the 4th section of the German intelligence service in Paris. After reviewing the telegram, the 4th section, based on past Allied troop movement patterns, determined that the U.S. forces were highly likely assembling a mechanized force of at least 2 divisions in the region. It's noteworthy that the main U.S. armored forces actually assembled on the southern coast of the English Channel at this time were almost entirely located between Portsmouth and Exeter, not in the Calais direction. Therefore, the false sense of presence deliberately created by the Ghost Army spread like ripples within the German intelligence system, triggering a series of chain reactions of misjudgments. During this period, the Allied High Command's Deception Planning Group closely monitored German telegrams and radio intercepts, using deciphered intelligence to confirm the effectiveness of the deception. In early June, an analysis report from Army Group North headquarters indicated that they had considered the Calais direction as one of the main possible areas for an Allied landing, anticipating the operation within 2 weeks. While not entirely definitive, the report's core assessment perfectly aligned with the desired misleading effect, focusing German attention on Calais and preventing a large-scale troop movement towards Normandy in the short term. As the deception continued to build, the Ghost Army maintained a seemingly increasing posture of troop build-up near Dover. They used not only acoustic simulations but also numerous inflatable tanks and fake artillery positions, equipment that appeared virtually flawless in aerial reconnaissance photographs. More importantly, to match the temporal progression of the acoustic illusions, operators periodically adjusted the deployment of these fake armored units, making them appear to move in accordance with real tactical logic. For example, when the acoustic simulation showed a large amount of mechanical noise converging in a specific direction, the fake tanks on the ground would adjust accordingly to create the illusion of advance in the photographs. Conversely, when the acoustic simulation indicated a pause in troop assembly, the fake tank formations would remain stationary. The combination of optics, acoustics, and radio made the entire deception system even more difficult to crack. During this period, the German army was not entirely without suspicion. An internal memo submitted by the German Western Front Intelligence Office on June 3 mentioned that the mechanical noise from the Allied forces in the Dover area may contain some degree of camouflage, but this warning, lacking concrete evidence, ultimately failed to influence the overall assessment. Part of the reason was that German reconnaissance aircraft were increasingly restricted in their flight altitude by air defenses, and ground reconnaissance could not cross the strait, leaving the intelligence chain extremely vulnerable, and any false information could be amplified. Furthermore, the uneven distribution of German listening posts throughout northern France, lacking cross-verification mechanisms in some directions, allowed the sound source matrix created by the Ghost Army to be misinterpreted as genuine ground information without being compromised. On the night of June 5, wind and sea conditions were extremely unfavorable, and the Germans generally believed that the Allies would not choose to launch any major operations under these weather conditions. However, it was at this critical moment that the team operating the sound equipment for the Ghost Army was asked to conduct one last large-scale simulation to create the illusion that a large armored force was preparing to advance towards the coast. In his post-war memoirs, Perkins mentioned that the sound field intensity that night was almost twice the usual level. They continuously played alternating sounds of armored engine noise, track friction, the metallic clanging of ammunition loading, and fragments of commands from 6 main sound sources, with all equipment running continuously until 3 a.m. German listening posts, despite the background noise of the storm, still recorded these mechanical sounds, even mistakenly concluding that the Allies were forcing a mobilization despite the severe weather. This assessment had a crucial impact on the German command. On the eve of D-Day, the German 15th Army remained convinced that the main Allied attack would be in Calais, not Normandy. Even on the morning of June 6, the day of the landings, some high-ranking German officers still believed the Normandy landings were a feint, and that the real large-scale landings would occur in the Calais direction. One of the key factors contributing to this entrenched belief was that German intelligence continued to receive simulated sound sources related to large-scale troop movements from the Dover direction, without realizing that these recordings originated from mechanical equipment operated by Holden and others. After the successful Allied landings in Normandy, the Ghost Army's sound simulation mission around Dover did not immediately end. To prolong the German miscalculation and hinder their troop redeployment from Calais to the front, the Ghost Army maintained its acoustic matrix for several days, leading the Germans to believe that the Allied Second Army or more armored forces might launch a new landing from Calais at any moment. This delay bought the Allies valuable time to establish a stable beachhead in Normandy. Throughout the operation, Holden, Perkins, Cressman, and Sadiq, along with their actors, technicians, and radio operators, formed an invisible front. They did not directly participate in combat, but played an irreplaceable role in sophisticated psychological warfare and technological deception. Acoustic deception techniques are not common in the history of warfare, but the Ghost Army's actions prove that sound can be a weapon influencing strategic judgment, not just background noise. They exploited weaknesses in the enemy's reconnaissance system, integrating recording tapes, inflatable equipment, radio deception, and terrain deployment into a unified whole, causing the enemy to unconsciously incorporate fictitious combat forces into their assessment.